This is Dr. John Spink, Director of the Food Fraud Initiative at Michigan State University, and this is part 2, Unintended Consequence of Growth and Innovation, for my presentation, Food Fraud and Crimes and Unintended Consequence of Economic Growth and Product Innovation. Please see part 1 for the beginning of this, the foundation, and also part 3 for the evolution of the research. Now we'll begin part 2. So, history of food fraud incidents. First off, food fraud has been recorded back thousands of years, literally. We did an article with some of the Chinese food safety government experts from the National Center for Food Safety Risk Assessment there in China, and there's evidence back and stories to 200 BCE regarding different types of fraud, things like fillers in chicken, different spices, and also for tea. So it's been going on for a while. Also, there's all this talk of Pliny the Elder in Roman times talked about counterfeiting food fraud. There's reports of French wine labeled as Roman wine and other things in stories. And then really the first U.S. food laws were in 1906 and 1938, which mentioned fraud jokesters at the start. So interesting that fraud was a part of that. And also the focus early on in 1906, 1938, and then really in the Food Safety Modernization Act still was diethylene glycol. So now we'd think of that as it's a sweet-tasting product that's actually in antifreeze but has caused problems along the way. It was definitely cited as one of the dangers for the triggers for the Food Safety Modernization Act back in 2011. Now what we've seen over time is these modern food fraud incidents have escalated. The danger has increased and the risks for companies, markets, and even countries. And a key with that is that there's more testing technology, there's more communication. So when we do find something, that information travels around the world. We're able to detect it, where in the past, it's most likely food fraud is occurring at the lowest rate it has in human history, probably. But we're getting bigger events, and also we're able to identify the events. Some of the modern food fraud incidents include Sudan red. This is a carcinogen colorant, and it's used in paprika and other spices to make it look redder, more fresh, I guess. That would be an adulterant substance. That was around 2004. Now, some of these types of fraud incidents occur and then kind of keep occurring, but really it was around 2004 when it was the biggest impact for us. Next in 2007 was melamine. That was in infant formula and in pet food. That's also an adulterant substance. Now being adulterant substance, these things caused harm. And so that's where there's a lot of focus, especially for the public health agencies. And even for law enforcement, because law enforcement prioritizes first public safety, that's drugs, guns, and violence, and then public health, or large-scale types of harms. After that are economic, large-scale crimes that disrupt governments or markets, and then just large-scale economic crimes, and then smaller-scale crimes. So a lot of times food fraud actually would fall into the category of a smaller economic-type fraud. So lower on that law enforcement list. But a key here is melamine was definitely a focus area because of the public health threat. And then 2012 was horse meat and beef. And again, that's an adulterant substance. There was no reported food safety incident hazard. Now there's some questions about different antibiotics and medicines used in horses, but it's been unclear on the public health aspect of that. But a key here, it could have. The vulnerability was immense, and really between 2007 that raised the awareness that this was something strategically at a corporate level. It was a corporate enterprise risk, and it started to be focused early on there in 2007, and then 2012 is really when it took off. Now a key for the development of all this process is that that horse meat incident occurred while the GFSI board was had monitored and was listening to a food fraud think tank that they created. So this just added more of an urgency to help GFSI move forward. So these are the modern incidents. Now many have occurred since then, but these are the real key, the real trigger ones for these activities. So to take a little step back, so this is a history department class, so I figured it was good to go back and look at a little bit of history, maybe a little bit looking in our own mirror. Counterfeiting in colonial America. So during the years following the Revolutionary War, the United States freely pirated pirated pharmaceuticals, books, and sheet music. So along the way, we were an emerging, developing country that had a lot of needs. So that was one thing that did occur, the pirating of these. U.S. Constitution does address patents and copyrights, but not trademarks. And it's a key to look back at the early years, and I think with the Constitution to understand what was going on at the time. So in that, under powers of Congress to provide the punishment of counterfeiting of securities and current coin of the United States, looking at currency. And then to promote the progress in science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors an exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. So this was the beginning of the patent and copyright, which is interesting at the same time that the U.S. was pirating other people's products as well, but it was something we saw as being very important. Also, really applicable to food fraud prevention, Ben Franklin has a quote, "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure," and definitely with food fraud, just a little bit of prevention can really go a long way in preventing the topic. Now, if an incident occurs, if you have to really protect the entire supply chain, monitoring product all the way from source all the way through, it is just a very complex and costly work. But one thing that we found, with Ben Franklin's quote, it was really regarding the Philadelphia Fire Department. He actually reportedly said an ounce of prevention is worth 10 pounds of cure. And so that actually does really apply here again, that with food fraud, that if we have a problem and we have to go back and address it after the fact, it's really been just immensely more costly and more out of control. So it's interesting to look at back of how we're looking at the history here as well. Something else about Ben Franklin and the U.S. is there during those early years after our independence, that Ben Franklin sent a lot of emissaries and groups and visitors around the world to really try to boost the economic output in the U.S. and investment in the U.S. And partially, they did go around and see new machinery, and they then copyrighted, or they pirated some of the designs even of some of those around the world. So it's interesting, fascinating to look at history and read up about the evolution and where our country was during development, and look at many parallels from around the world. If we're looking at evolution in history, with food fraud, we see that there's really two tracks that have occurred. And one is this public health food focus. And these are food laws, health issues. And way back in 1820, really what's considered the source of a lot of this type of work was Frederick Ackium had a book on food adulterations. And he really looked at testing to try to identify these adulterant substance products. Now, one thing that he did, he didn't define adulteration, adulterant, or adulterating, or counterfeiting for that matter. He just all of a sudden jumped into it. And I think that's something since the very beginning of the science in this area, there's been a lack of definitions. And that lack of definitions, or setting the scope, setting the overall objectives, has been a real challenge. When we look back, one of the terms that's been used along the way is economic adulteration. Now, my mother was a elementary school grammar and other teacher, and she would say that when we look at these words, economic and adulteration, that the impact is only economic and it's only adulteration. And if we think of adulteration as a substance, then we think it's only an economic impact of this substance being put in. And that's definitely not the case. Early on, the first mention we found of economic adulteration used in this type of space was the FDA juice review, and that was in 1996. One thing about in that report, they emphasized over and over again that this was not a public health threat. So that probably helped this be a more calm report, but at the same time, it did a disservice because it didn't even emphasize that this could be a vulnerability along the way. So early on, the whole idea of economic adulteration was that it definitely was not a public health threat. And that kind of set things off and maybe even set things aside for a while. Because again, if we're looking at food and public health, FDA as a public health agency, if there's no economic or no public health threat, then that is a lower priority. Economically motivated adulteration, EMA. Now we're coming up this next summer on the 10th anniversary, which is either wonderful or very sad that it's taken so long for really things to happen. But this was another I guess evolution here, looking at economically motivated adulteration. Now I don't know exactly how that is very much different than economic adulteration. It just may be that now the economic gain was a motivation for the adulteration. But along there was a focus and narrowing the definition. The working definition for that meeting was a substance for economic gain. not all types of adulteration and not all types of fraud. Now, at this point with EMA, that ended up being a focus back on just a substance, not all types of fraud, and also definitely on a health hazard. When there's a health hazard, there was a focus and priority by FDA, by the scope that Congress gives FDA. And when there's no health hazard, it becomes a much lower priority. So EMA was actually a bit of a confusing point for almost all 10 years since then, because there was this belief that this was the only focus of FDA. And that's actually incorrect. Now, the focus by FDA is, again, on public health threats. So a substance in there would be causing problems. But really, for FDA, the laws themselves, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, is still in effect. And that requires addressing all adulterated foods and all misbranded foods. So even if there's not a public health threat, it still must be analyzed, assessed, a hazard analysis documented regardless of the outcome, meaning regardless of whether it's actually a hazard or not. But also misbranded foods. That could be country of origin. That could be the weights are off. That product is illegal. So even though the focus of FDA and the Public Health Agency is on the health hazards, this is a product that's still illegal. So there was this confusion that FDA was only, that a violation was only if it was a substance, only if it was a health hazard, and that's definitely not the case. So public health is a contaminant, and really along the way you test for contaminant. That's the way the research went going. If there's no contaminant, there's no problem. And there again, that kind of led us to a dead end, because when the problem came up, we tested for it, and all of a sudden we kind of tested our way out of it, it seemed. Now, another track is products, and this is something that's been going on for years as well, counterfeiting or intellectual property rights. And so that's completely faking of the product. A challenge here was similar to with food, is that if something falls specifically into this category, then it has a focus. But a problem with intellectual property rights is resource allocation. If there's not an imminent public health threat, then it's not this public health type incident. And economically, it would fall farther down on the priority setting that Congress sets forth to the law enforcement agencies to, again, focus first on public safety, drugs, guns, and violence, public health, wide-scale harms, and then economic harms, which are farther down. And we're in an environment of constrained resources and continuing to be further constrained resources. So there's just less resources for these not things that are not the highest priority. And that's not only in the U.S., that's definitely worldwide. Counterfeiting had a focus on packaging. So in another case that you'd look at the product and package being counterfeited, and the easiest thing to do is to address something on the package. So the packaging or the package itself, the process. And we really looked at protecting the package. This caused a little bit of a challenge as well. So you see previously on the public health track, no contaminant, no problem. And on the counterfeiting side, the focus was on the package. And really a lot of times a criticism is that a lot of the tracking technologies, a lot of the authentication technologies authenticate the label or the package, not the product inside. Think about a tomato. A tomato has on it might have a sticker with a barcode. That barcode may even have a serial number. What we're doing is really tracking that label. If that label got peeled off and put on a tomato label got put on an orange, then that would definitely cause a problem and confusion in the system. What we see is the need to focus broadly, and that we see the focus evolving to all fraud. And then really starting to have in the food industry, the very practical question of why act? Do we have to act? And then how much is enough? And that's something that is really finally getting down to the real root cause of what to do. So before getting on, we'll look at the regulations, enforcement lag, business and criminal innovation. And it's really important here to look at the overall process. So business and criminals innovate quickly. You think about how much has been going on right now, just unbelievable levels of innovation. The amount of communication we have, the ability to talk live around the world is absolutely astronomical, just unbelievable. And so businesses are very, very good at adapting and innovating quickly. Laws and regulations slowly adapt. So it takes a while to figure out what should we do? What is the real problem? What gets to the point of it being prioritized? If you think about things like the Food Safety Modernization Act, so that came out in 2011, and the final rules came out sometimes 5 years later. That's because these are long, complex laws and regulations, and they have to be in detail. These are things that have 90-day or 180-day development cycles, review cycles. So even FDA, when they put something out for public comment, it's 90 or 180 days before they even get the comments back. And it's critical to the process. That's not, it would seem slow, but it's actually methodical. And that's what it's supposed to be, so that these laws get put in place and they're consistent. So it sometimes can take that long for, different groups, companies, agencies or associations to really review that. So with businesses and criminals innovating quickly, you've got these laws and regulations adapting slowly. And one thing we'll look at is also to see an example and something that even law enforcement that's in place looking, there's still this lag because the criminals are very quick to move, and we have to then reallocate resources. If you think about an agency, they're also judged over the course of a year on success metrics. So you set these metrics in place and then you go about judging them. And for one thing, it could be things like the U.S. Customs with seizures, the amount of products that they seize or people that they arrest. One thing we've seen is that there's a shift, and we'll show some slides on this. There was a shift in the counterfeiters sending into the U.S., specifically in this example, full shipping containers of counterfeit products. Think about things like cigarettes or pharmaceuticals or counterfeit T-shirts. Full shipping containers come in. So that's big, but then they've been shifting to parcel shipments, which will be like mail, things over the mail. So instead of one big shipping container, they might send in 100 cases or pallets shipping in. Why are they doing that? They're doing that because the information technology has led us to be better at identifying or x-raying or artificial intelligence looking at and reading what's in a full container. And you could catch and seize one full container. Now, that would cost a lot of money for a counterfeiter. So if they break this up, and even if they have higher transportation costs by going to send 100 separate parcels, the chance that all of them are going to get caught is very low. And again, products moving so fast through these mail facilities that led to a big shift. So, and also one thing I've got to say is even the scale is difficult to estimate of counterfeiting. There's been, in a meeting, we heard some people on a sidebar discussion say that they wondered if they only caught the sloppy and the unlucky. Or even if counterfeiters sent purposely very sloppy product through to get the attention of investigators. So while they're focused on those products, that some legitimate products go through the supply chain. So when we consider that, even the scale is difficult to estimate. In reality, when we're looking at prevention and vulnerabilities, then it's very cost efficient to look at eliminating vulnerabilities, regardless of exactly what the economic impact is. So when we look at definitions and scale of why this is unknowable, the scale itself. So given the clandestine nature of businesses, such estimates can be no more than educated guesses. We don't know who's doing the counterfeiting and how much they're doing, how much gets through. Is it high quality versus low quality? We have really no idea of the product that we seize, what percent that is of what we catch. 10%, 1%, 0.1%, 1/100th of a percent, 1,000th of a percent. We really have no idea. We can make educated guesses, but unless we see really the impact, the incidents occur in public health incidents, it's really hard to judge. If the bad guys are good at what they do, they make products that don't make people sick, that the consumers are satisfied with the product itself. This is confidential or classified information. So whether it's customs agencies sharing it or investigations ongoing with law enforcement, or with industry, it's either confidential or classified. So sharing of information is very difficult. Limited sharings of customs seizure data. So even the data of product that has been seized is difficult to get. And the OECD does occasional reports on reviewing the economic impact of counterfeiting and piracy, and they survey customs agencies around the world. And the big survey they did 2008 time period, maybe a little earlier than that, is that they did not get customs information from China. I believe it was definitely not China and the U.S., and I believe it was also Russia, maybe India, and a couple, Brazil. So some of the biggest economies in the world didn't submit their customs information. Now, there's a lot of reasons why they might do that. One is that if you're really good at catching counterfeits as they're leaving your country, let's say that the state of Michigan, where I live, is really good at catching counterfeits before it leaves the state. Well, if we then submitted this data that we caught all this counterfeit product in Michigan, there might be this belief that Michigan is a lot worse than other places. Michigan may not be worse than other places, but we're just really good at catching it. So there's definitely legitimate political reasons why there would be this limited sharing of information. Differences in seizure definitions. My goodness, around the world, definitions, harmonization of terms, this is something you'll constantly hear us talk about and focus on. So there's different scopes and scales. So if you look at one category, in the U.S., a lot of times counterfeiting is under counterfeiting and forgery. That would include currency counterfeiting. That would include forgery of driver's licenses. So that single category would have to be split up. So 1 million items might have to be hand reviewed and resorted. Same in the EU. The RASIF database has a table for food, for adulteration and fraud. That's great. It's much more narrow. It's food, adulteration, fraud, but a real challenge there is it's both intentional and unintentional fraud. So accidental mislabeling or something like that would lead to an economic gain. So you'd have to go line by line to figure that out. Tougher to detect. So we definitely see an improving quality of the fakes and improving stealth in the supply chain. That's a real key, and the bad guys are really good at figuring that out. So that all leads us to be very challenged when we're trying to estimate the scale of fraud. What we do know is the vulnerabilities, and that's where focus has been for us. And there's a quote: "We know what we seized, but we don't know what we didn't seize," and it's real key. So, got a little activity for you. So this is criminal justice data. So pick the source economy. Now, this is seizure data by source. That's country source from the EU, and it's 2005. Now, that might seem like old data, but the application still applies. So for food, what country do you think is the number one source of fraudulent food? Let's say counterfeit or fraudulent food, or what's really the top 5. But think about the number 1 and 2. Think about the number 1 and 2. Turkey, Russia, Ukraine, China, Switzerland. There's the top 5. You got to watch out for those Swiss. No, I'm just kidding there. But the key is wow, that is very, very surprising to have Turkey be number 1 and Switzerland there as well. But Indonesia, Bulgaria, I mean those are countries you wouldn't think about a lot of volume there. So that's the number of cases. But now break down to the number of articles seized. So what you've got in the first category is the number of cases, incidents. That could be a product that's in a trunk, in a suitcase, or others. And below, you've got the number of items seized. So if you seize a suitcase full of counterfeit product, there's not going to be that many units in there. That's going to be in there, the number of articles seized. If you seize a shipping container, that's going to be a bigger number. So look at this, where Turkey is the number 1 for cases, but then way down there, 2% of the seizure of the articles seized. What is common about the 4 of the 5 countries were for the number of cases seized? Turkey, Russia, Ukraine, Switzerland. We'll say Bulgaria as well. A land border with Europe. That's a key. That's why Switzerland is up there as well. Switzerland is actually outside the EU. So product that goes into Switzerland and then crosses the Swiss border would be an international border for them. So that's a key as land product. So that's either a truck or a car. Somebody coming over the border. And that's why then when you look at the number of articles, China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Syria, those are all would be through ports. They'd have to come from farther outside. So especially China, Hong Kong, Taiwan would be more shipping containers coming over. And so you have one shipping container versus one trunkload of product. That's something to think about. So it's interesting even to look at the data itself to dig into the details. So this is to look at the amount of units seized, and this is the 2010 seizure statistics for the U.S. Customs. The number of IPR seizures increased 34% to 20,000 in 2010 from 14,000 in 2009, yet the domestic value decreased 27%. Due to the following reasons: increase in the amount of high-volume, low-value express consignment mail seizures. So they're seizing parcels, not not the big pieces, and consolidated shipment seizures. So that's looking at things that are more again the smaller groups coming through. So the number of seizures increased, but the quantity went down quite a bit. So there's a real challenge. Now think about this from U.S. Customs of training, education, resources, equipment used to analyze a truck and trailer versus those. So there's a lot of innovation that needs to occur. A solution looking for a problem. So when we're looking at this unintended consequence of growth, we've got two challenges here. One is that we've got a solution seeking a problem. And so what we mean by this is a lot of times when we have technology, we find something interesting for technology and we now try to see a problem of where we can apply it. So looking at like the change from the U.S. Customs there, then they're now starting to hear from people that are proposing these solutions. The result that we've got here is really a lot of times no action, or I'd say unpredictable or uncertain. So we've got a situation where a customer defines a problem. Let's say that it's customs, or remember that track or the definitions that was counterfeiting. We'll say it's counterfeiting. The customer asks for help and looks around. So that could be the brand owner saying, we need to do something. We've got counterfeiting, and it's natural to look at the products itself. What we've seen is that when you get to really looking at this, it's been unclear exactly how these countermeasures actually help. Why no action? We'll say root cause is undefined. And the root cause isn't just counterfeiting. The root cause is how a criminal decides to take an action to commit that counterfeiting, how they do it, how they see that going in their system. So when we see that without that root cause, there's no decision-making mechanism as well. So really we need to step back and look at who's the customer, what's the problem, and who is the helper. Who is the person that's helping guide this process. So that's what we saw with that first action. And what we've got again, so that the trigger of an event, the trigger of action is that there's a counterfeit package is found. It's given to the packaging group because it's a counterfeit package. So there's this belief that it's this package itself. We need to do something with it. Now detecting which package is genuine and not is important. So it goes to the packaging group. And they consider a packaging risk treatment. So the package is the problem. It goes to a packaging group. So here's a breakdown. The recommendation. $3 million in package increased costs, and it goes to purchasing. And the purchasing group will then say, okay, where do we bill the extra expense? Nowhere, no action. So what we see sometimes is this counterfeit package is found. The packaging group seeks a anti-counterfeiting component, and then recommends to the purchasing department what to do to grow that, and all of a sudden then there's no budget for it. It just kind of moves around parallel, and that's been a real challenge and something that's led to things kind of hitting a roadblock. So overall, we've seen this economic growth that leads to these other challenges of evolving the way that we interact with things, and now that we're looking at a new type of act, a rapidly evolving act, then the science itself has to really evolve. So with the result, we have the result of delay and misdirection. The focus starts with the very near and familiar. We'd say that is the counterfeit package, and then looking at packaging. And with that, then we look at first to intervention. We want to detect and test if that package is genuine or not. And then once we find that, we want to be able to respond. That's find it and remove it. So right there, we're still very tactical. We're in the system. We're doing something that's really, really key. But really, we have a challenge here that at this point, we need to go back to prevention. And testing and detecting and finding and removing is really after the incident occurs. It's like getting to a hospital and waiting for people to come in and then trying to treat them. And the thing is if say that it's smoking or something, then prevention isn't occurring there after the problem occurs. It's really back in education. That's very different than things that happen in an emergency room. That's other types of early interventions as well. So when we look at the motivation of the root cause, those are very, very different tasks, and the role and responsibility is very different in the overall supply chain. We see this focus on public health. And again, if there's no public health threat, there's no action. And that's it. Well, I would say no action by the public health agency. That's an action for someone else. Now, it's one thing if we're talking about cigarette smoking and smoking cessation, because within the public health purview, the scope of FDA, things like smoking cessation would be in their scope. But if it gets to be something like crime prevention, target hardening, that would move from FDA over to law enforcement, and then even over to other types of laws and regulations that would require other types of activities, or even to business decision making. And that's further outside even government control. So what we see is this continual and repeated dead end. That's been a problem, and that's been happening with counterfeiting. It's been happening with food fraud over the years, as we said, since 200 BCE. So with that, that's the foundation of where we felt that we were, and we started to look at how the science needed to step back to the very basics before moving forward. And really, prevention is interdisciplinary, and that's very challenging and complex. Once the system's set up, it can be very efficient and operational. But going from these silos or different individual disciplines working on something to interdisciplinary is very complex. That actually takes some overall governance and organizational behavior insight before even really getting things started. So that's the end of part 2.